Thank you very much, Chuck. You mentioned that the Midwest starts someplace west of Pittsburgh, just west of Pittsburgh, which everyone agrees with, or most people do, but it ends somewhere out in the middle of Kansas or Nebraska or somewhere. The western boundary is not exactly clear. Well, I'm happy to report that the Center for Western Studies is going to be publishing a book with the title, Where Does the Midwest End and the Great Plains Begin, in 2018. So we will have a definitive answer to that question in coming years. Our next speaker today is Virgil Dean. Virgil is a native of Franklin County, Kansas. He's been writing about Kansas history for 3 decades. And for more than 20 years, Virgil has been the editor of the academic journal Kansas History. He's been a lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Kansas, and he has also taught at Washburn University and Emporia State University. Virgil is also the author of several books on the history of Kansas. Virgil.
Thank you, John. This kind of follows on something John just mentioned. I thought I should begin by admitting that my credential for inclusion in this panel could be challenged on the grounds that I am a longtime editor of a publication that identified itself as a journal of a Plains state, Kansas History, a journal of the Central Plains, nearly 40 years ago. I wasn't involved in that name decision, but nevertheless, could be a factor. I would also draw your attention, maybe more significantly, to the fact that a writer with the Pioneer Press out of the Twin Cities recently drew Kansas and Nebraska completely out of the Midwest. But I'm inclined to disagree pretty strongly with that characterization, or that delineation. Kansas is simply too often, I think, referred to as the heartland to be so easily dismissed from the region. I prefer instead the more inclusive definition of the heartland or the Midwest offered by the American Midwest, or the American Midwest, an interpretive encyclopedia, which uses the Census Bureau definition, and one provided by KU's James R. Shortridge, who wrote an important book on the region, The Middle West, Its Meaning in the American culture over 25 years ago. Actually, if I read his fine book correctly, Professor Shortridge finds many different Middle Wests, which are determined by one's perspective. One could almost say that from this point of view, the Midwest is a state of mind rather than a mere geographic region, which is exactly, I find very interesting, what historian Carl Becker said of the state of Kansas back in 1910. So surely Kansas must belong. Seriously, I think this gets to the core of one of the problem or issue that we are here to discuss. One of the editors of the encyclopedia that I mentioned wrote, quote, "The American Midwest means different things to different people. Its shape and contours shift dramatically depending on where you are standing. Even the people of the Midwest cannot always agree on where the region begins and ends." The same thing can be and has been said about Kansas and Kansans. There is generally uncertainty among Kansans about where they actually belong, and identity crisis of sorts. I think that's been going on for a long time. Are we in the Middle West, the West, the Plains? Just exactly where are we, or where do we belong? One could also argue that we Kansans have long been fixated on the question, what is Kansas? As well as what is the matter with Kansas? So perhaps we should ask, what is the Middle West? This may be the problem we face as historians of this nebulous region. The reason, or at least one reason, why Midwestern history has suffered while the history of several other regions has flourished in recent years. That said, however, as we consider the need to revive Midwestern history, I'd also like to echo a recent H Midwest comment by Larry Wagner, the director of the Michigan State Historical Society, which was actually, I think, a response to one of John's posts. He said we should not forget, quote, the vibrant activities that are being done within the states in the Midwest and the high level of activity, including at the scholarly level, among our state historical societies and similar organizations, end quote. I think specifically of scores of great articles published each year in many solid state history journals, including but not limited to the Michigan Historical Review, Minnesota History, the Missouri Historical Review, the Annals of Iowa, South Dakota History, and, if I might be so bold and self-serving, Kansas History, a journal of the Central Plains. In that vein, I thought I might focus my remarks for a few moments on just a few of the articles that we've published with broader regional implications in recent years in Kansas history, which has for the past 4 years been a joint publication of the State Historical Society and Kansas State University. Not be confused with Kansas University in this case. Last summer, we published an article by Jay Price of Wichita State titled Peerless Princess of the Southwest, Boosterism and Regional Identity in Wichita, Kansas. Jay argued that although today it is thought of as a city of the Midwest, Wichita's identity has shifted several times through the city's history. Initially, the city aligned itself with the Southwest, a region connected to Texas and Indian Territory, but early boosters also hoped for a greater role as a crossroads of the country. More recently, Wichitans have seen themselves at various times as part of the Great Plains, the West, and the Midwest. At other times, local identity emphasized a center city USA image. In a forthcoming article, Jeffrey Stone, an adjunct professor at Texas Wesleyan University in Fort Worth, takes a fascinating look at the competition to claim ownership of the center of the nation. That's the subtitle of his work, or the article. His initial focus is the small northern Kansas town of Lebanon that established itself officially as the geographic center of the U.S. in 1940. But the town's proud claim was immediately and continually challenged by states and towns throughout the region for promotional and legitimate geographic reasons. Drawing from maps produced by commercial advertisers, city and state chambers of commerce, publications, the federal government, Stone details the cartographic campaign of the Lebanon Hub Club, which is great, to solidify its prestige as the national center against multitude of would-be usurpers. A couple of years ago, we published Charles Delgadillo's A Pretty Weedy Flower, William Allen White, Midwestern Liberalism, and the 1920s Culture War. The author here argues that Midwesterners helped to advance reform during the Progressive era by collaborating with their counterparts in the urban East. But the Culture War of the 1920s stifled reform by disrupting this alliance. Midwestern reformers were in a particularly peculiar position since the same cultural ideals that fueled their reform spirit helped to drive the decade's culture war. The celebrated editor of the Emporia Gazette, William Allen White, embodied this dilemma. To White, the Midwest community values constituted the foundations of both liberalism and democracy in America, but not even an exemplary Midwesterner or Midwestern liberal such as White was able to resist the cross-currents of the culture war. And of course, we've published several things over the years on image. most notably perhaps a review essay by James R. Pete Shortridge, Regional Image and Sense of Place in Kansas, and Thomas Fox Averill's contribution to our special sesquicentennial issue, Flyover Country, Images of Kansas. At least since Coronado, so the story goes, or at least since Coronado, so the story goes, had the guide who led him to the region executed, the image has concerned the inhabitants and potential inhabitants of this place we now call Kansas. Shortridge examined the literature and explored the importance of place-based symbols and myth in the development of Kansas. Scholars have long argued that such imagery influences outsiders in their decisions where to visit or to establish their business. It also affects how local residents perceive themselves and their role within the broader society, according to Shortridge. Kansas is that great middle part of the United States that many people call flyover country, wrote Professor Averill. And as a result, most people know very little about the place. Instead, Kansas, like so many other states at the heart of the country, is mostly an abstraction. Abstractions, of course, this is Averill, invite and support stereotypes. In more recent years, those stereotypes have led to negative images in the popular mind or culture, and Kansas often is a metaphor for obscurity. At the same time, our state, and I might add our region, is also characterized as the heartland, a place reflective of and vital to the needs and desires of the whole. But this is largely an abstraction. We must negotiate a new way of thinking about ourselves and our country, explained Averill. We must let them fly over while we stand with our feet in the mud and our hearts in the land, sturdy and ordinary, experts on ourselves. If we can do that, maybe other Americans can learn to do it too, and find themselves grounded in the places where they live. Perhaps the revival of Midwest studies can contribute to this objective for the region. I'll conclude by saying that our part of the country might not get the respect and scholarly attention it deserves as a region, but I want you to know that we have our own beer, which I consider very important. Boulevard, I just found this not too long ago. A Midwest, or as Midwest as it gets. And I'll go on and say, and what can be more important than that, of course? I prefer our local, Lawrence, Kansas Free State, but Boulevard, which is unfortunately brewed just across the state line, is nevertheless really a nice beer, hard-working, and reliable, I might say. Well, it's at least, it's at least, as Garrison Keillor might say, above average.